Welcome to the third part of this tutorial series on using Blender for architectural design. So in the last two versions, we set up our masking, we set up our context, and we even created a little script to be able to automate our cameras for generating different options. I would definitely suggest you check those two videos out before we move on to this one. But once you're ready, we can carry on and have all the fun that we can generate based on everything we set up this far. So let's go ahead now and check out our facade panels, where we're going to be able to change these into anything that we basically want. Right? So we've got one over here, which I'm going to duplicate. So Shift D to duplicate. And let's see if I'm just going to put it over here. And now we can go and start generating different things. So I want something that has something vertical, but again, we read this middle bit as the strongest. Or even better yet, why don't we just try to set up the part where we can have a number of kind of random but similar variations. So how would that look with this kind of panel that we've got over here? So one, we're going to need to, again, duplicate this. I'm going to duplicate it over here with Shift D. And what would be different? Maybe, as a start, this angle is slightly different. So instead of coming out this way, it's coming out in some other way. And right now, you see these two are linked. And in fact, we need to change it in both of them. So let's select our glass here and right click and split. So when we move that with G, that's its own completely separate element. And let's do the same over here. So we need to go back into object mode and into edit mode to make sure that we change this. So let's click on this face with tree selection, right click and split. So now they're different. Great. And let's go back now into this object over here. And what are we going to do? We're going to maybe just to see how it works, how this system works, is change this panel so it's not angled and it protrudes a lot more and also in the opposite direction. So let's go into something like this. We're going to keep this horizontal element pretty much the same. So let's go now and we're going to get rid of this face, move this edge over here. Right now we're trying to keep it as simple as possible. And now move this edge somewhere over here. With the edge selection, with the edge selected, let's go and extrude. And if we snap, everything is snapped into place. And now they're similar, but different. The first thing that we want to do is link the object data so it goes to this object over here. Let's minimize this over here. Do something like that. Okay. And now in here, if we go and see, this is called facade element.003. So what we need to do is select this, shift select this, and shift select this, and then shift select this. Make sure this is the last selection because that is the active one. And now we're going to press Ctrl L, and that's a pop-up menu to link and transfer data. And we want to link object data. And now all of that data is linked. And now this looks different. And in fact, I'm going to run the script that we set up in the previous one. And let's call this option 02, just so we can compare. And I'm going to let it run. And in the folder that it's located, it made a number of extra options. And now I'm going to compare them. So let's see all the options that we've got. And so this is option 01. That's the one that we rendered in the last version. And this is option 02. So let's compare this with this. And not 3, I want 2. There you go. So that's the difference between them. They're kind of the same, but also different because they just angle different directions. And we can do the same with the other side. just so we have a very easy way to compare it. Great, so how do we mix those two together? So let's leave this over here, go back into our regular layout. And this facade now, this is going to go away. And remember how we set this up here, which is with geometry nodes. It's a very simple geometry node setup, which is just grabbing everything that we have in this initial collection and populating it on the other side. So it's a literal duplicate. So now this facade here, instead of being linked to one of our object options, we're going to link it. So let's select these three and then shift select again this empty one, Control L, link object data. And we're back to square one. Okay, but not so much, because now we're going to create another object geometry nodes element in here. So let's just add a simple cube and let's call it facade geonodes. Okay, and we can hide now our facade base, because all of that information is going to come in here. Let's switch to geometry nodes editor, and I'm going to move myself to the right so you can see that. Geometry nodes editor, we create a new one, make sure we have everything selected here, and let's now move facade base into here. Okay, so now if we put it into relative, it's exactly the same. However, now we're going to use these points, the central points of each of these facade elements, to instantiate either this element or that element over here. So how do we do that? First off, we want to make sure that these two are in their own collection. So we have facade panels. So let's create a new one, new collection that's called facade panels chosen, or we'll just say chosen, and put these two. So this one goes in there and this one goes in there. Okay, now let's click on the geometry nodes facade element that we've got over here. We're going to drag this collection chosen into here. Okay, and now we're going to use something called instance on points. So the points are going to come from the instances, and the instances are from here. We want to separate the children, and then if we put as an instance, I think we need to put reset children, and you see now we get all these facade elements. But there are too many of them. That is because at the moment we're using each of the 4 corner points of each face. You can kind of see where it's coming from. So instead of doing that, what we want to do is realize these instances, realize instances. Let's move these over a little bit. And once they're realized, it's still a bit strange, right? Everything. Is everything the right scale? Okay, so we have a scale issue here, which is we can't. And that's, let's see, how should we do this? It's the thing that I keep talking about, which is our world scale is not 1 to 1 to 1. So we have to apply it. So Control A is the hotkey, scale, Control A, scale. Okay, now that looks exactly the same. And now we want to use a node called mesh to points. And instead of vertices, which is, as you can see, exactly what it's doing here, we want there to be 1 point of the center of each face. So if we click here and say faces, that should kind of do it. Let's see what's going on here. Now we might have more faces than we need. Let's see. Yeah, I'm not sure why we have all these faces. So there's something wrong with our panel. And let's go back into here, select everything, and then M, and then by distance. And yes, for some reason we had twice of everything. So now that should be more correct. Okay. And now everything is slightly changed and slightly moved over because it's dealing with the origin point that we have set up over here. So if we want the origin point to be at the correct position, and by the way, like when we move this, it has no effect whatsoever because everything is based on its original and its location. So let's get rid of this. So now all we need to do is transform this half the distance of the bounding box down. So once we realize the instances, it doesn't matter where, we just need a transform geometry node. And let's move this minus 1.5. And now that is completely correct, except it's got the added benefit that, well, first off, these are mirrored. Why are they mirrored? Let's see. We don't have a modifier of any kind. That's interesting. Anyways, so it actually aligns really well, except that bottom part over there. Ah, yes, that's right. So right now we're actually getting both of those. What we need to click is pick instance. And you see now with our very subtle differences here, we are getting that kind of variation that we want to express. And what if we want to make it more expressive? Well, we can pick a random instance based on the instance index. So we go and let's find random value. And that should be based on an integer. And we know in this case we have 2 instances, but sometimes we might have more. So the random value is the index between these 2 things. So let's just plug this in now. And you see, if we change the seed, things are starting to change, right? And just to make it a little bit more obvious, I'm going to change this material into a different one that's got a different color. There you go. So now we have a much better understanding of that. So we can either leave this as blank and just play with the index, or if you want to be a little bit more accurate, the maximum can be the number of instances that we have here. And we do that with a domain size item in here. And we plug this in, and from instead of mesh, we get instances, and it's telling us the instance count. So the minimum is this, and the instance count is the maximum that we get in here. But because these are indices, we want to remove 1 from the instance count. I mean, it's a bit silly here because the number is going to be 1 because we're just dealing with 2. But I want to explain the logic to you. So no matter how many instances of different facade elements we have, and you know what? Let's go crazy over here and do some weird things. So I'm just gonna duplicate this a bunch of times, and because it's all in the same collection, right, that's really important. And we're going to keep making new materials with different colors. Okay, so now we have 4 items in here. 4, yeah, so this is 4, but the index starts with the count of 0, so we need to subtract 1. So vector math, subtract, wrong one. So let's type for subtract, and we want to use integer math, which is a new node in Blender 4.3, and this is version 4.3. And we want to subtract 1 value, and that's our maximum now. So now if we hover over this, it should tell us we have a maximum of 3. So we get a random index for each item that's being picked in here based on the seed, yeah, and they vary, and we can even see it here. So now what if we want to add a balcony to just one of these? No problem. So I'm editing this one, and let's go and extrude. First I'm going to duplicate this, so Shift D and escape to leave it in the same place. And now let's go and extrude something like this. Maybe we can be even more precise because it's just right there, why not, right? So minus 1.5 meters, and let's add a bit of depth. So 0.1. Let's grab this edge, Shift D, and the same thing, escape. Now let's make this 1 meter tall and extrude this. And because we need to have the edges on the other side as well, we're going to do this slightly different. First, we're going to extrude these two edges to here, and that one I'm going to move over until we reach the edge here. Now let's select these two edges here, and we're going to do something that's extrude along normals. So let's grab this and let's make sure offset even is on, and there it is. And let's type 0.02. I want to go in the opposite direction, negative 0.02, just so we covered the edge of that. Great. And now you can see how we're starting to get this looking over here. So it's kind of cool, right? I mean, it looks totally different, even though it's kind of similar. Let's select, I don't know if I can do that actually. I'll just do it one by one. I'm going to select this object over here, which is our horizontal. Create a new material and call it facade horizontal. Facade horizontal. Okay. Now it's really interesting because my previous iteration when I was doing this, I was focused more on vertical, but now we're actually doing the opposite, and I don't mind that. That's the beauty of design discoveries, right? Of design iterations and explorations. And don't worry, we're going to save all of these so we can see them side by side with which one might work better. Okay. So let's select this by clicking L, assign. Let's give it a different viewport color just so we know what it is. And I'm just going to do this now really quickly. Facade horizontal, assign. I think I need to do this. Let's try it with these two. I think I need to do this one by one because it's whatever the active one is that I'm adding the new material slot. But I'm just curious. Yeah, doesn't work that way. So there is a way, as you can see, to edit multiple objects at the same time, but not all the materials come true. There you go. So now we can change that into its own different setting here. Now these balconies, they're quite... We should soften up the edges a little. So we can do that with holding these edges here and adding a bevel weight. And we also need to do the same with the slab edge that we've got over here. And that one is going to be a little bit difficult to select. Did I select the right one? Yep. Bevel weight 1. And bevel weight 1. There you go. So now we're going to add a bevel modifier. So add modifier, bevel. And instead of limit method being angle, what we want to do is use limit method being weight. So as you can see, everything stays the same except these edges. And we can already see the difference over here. So if we just keep one segment, we have this sort of chamfered look. And if we add more, like 20, then it becomes soft, much softer. And that glass that we've got is too dark, so let's brighten it up a little. Perhaps make it more metallic. Let's try something like 0.9 for now. There you go. Great. So now we just go to our geometry nodes, which is facade, facade. And we play with this seat. And every time it can look a little different. What about the rear? The rear is selecting something else. It is already geometry nodes. It is individual, but it's selecting our collection, which is called facade base. And remember, we changed the facade base from having a panel to being blank because we're using that as a base mesh for our tessellation. So instead of selecting this collection info, all we need is to grab our facade geonodes, drag it into here, use the relative location, and plug it into there. And now whatever we do on one side is going to be also the same on the other side. So let's select this side. And if we keep adjusting the seat, you see that we're getting all these random variations. Now this one, maybe it's a little bit too crazy, I would say. Not too crazy, but not particularly, like all the variations, they don't add that much difference, do they? So instead of doing that, what we can start to do is, first off, I really like these vertical elements that we've got, and I don't even know, like it's a hard one to judge, right? Like what makes one facing one way better than facing the other way? I'm not really sure, but we can try to be a bit bolder now and go to top view. And what if we select these and make that just a balcony? And now that looks even more random, doesn't it? And I'm not sure that I like it. So I'm going to go and undo. Let's get rid of this one. And perhaps we're just going to have two. I'm going to get rid of this one, but I'm not going to delete it. I'm just going to drag it out of our facade option here, collection. So now we should just have these two over here, and they're both going in the same direction. And I would like to change that direction by selecting that and selecting that. Let's see if it works. And we're just going to do a -1 and then drag this edge. Now that face, let's delete it because it's still connected. Duplicate this edge here and now extrude to here. Make sure we make this glass again. And I think this one was already separate, so that's quite all right. And we want to grab this edge over here and move that to here, like that. Now let's change the materiality. So if we select this, that should go to facade panel, and also these two. Let them go to facade panel, just so we understand what is what. We can give it a slight color. Now this here is also going with facade panel, but we've got like two categories here, right? We have something that pops up and something that doesn't. So then the question is, do we keep that part of the same language, or do we decide that, you know what, maybe they should have third? I wouldn't make it glass just because I know glass gets really dirty really quickly. So it can be solid, but it can be some kind of other material, which might be, for the purposes of now, some medium gray. There you go. And the last thing that we need to do is, because now we have introduced some rounded edges, we need to right click and shade auto smooth. And that should, if we turn off the wireframe, give us both smoothness where we need it and hard edges where we need to. Now, when we're rendering, face orientation is going to start becoming quite important, and we have a number of faces that are facing the wrong way. So let's select everything, go to search and recalculate outside, mesh normals, recalculate outside. So that fixes this. Same here. Or we can just click these two and Alt-N to flip O10 is the menu for normals, which is also found here, object. We have to be now in edit mode. So mesh, and then normals. And then flip or recalculate outside. While we're at it, let's fix this as well. O10, calculate out O10, flip. Flip. Here as well, O10, flip. And here, O10, flip. Here you go. So as you can see, all the normals are facing the right way in both directions, everything everywhere. That's a good thing to have. So let's turn off the face orientation now. And we're ready for rendering another option. Now we don't see this because it's kind of to the screen, but here we are. And let's call this option 03. And again, this is going to render all the cameras that we have. We have 5 cameras in our set location, which is here in the output. And if we make that relative, it picks all that up. And let's click on render. And it's ready. And just to show you. So here's this option. Which is slightly different. Okay, so that's kind of one design language. And I have to say, I really like the first one, the initial one, actually the best, because we have the complexity of the form that's moving around, but everything inside, you know, it has to be secondary to that, doesn't it? Because if it's not, it starts to really compete with everything else that we've got going. At the same time, we do need some balconies in here. So we have to figure out a way to perhaps make them lighter, or perhaps they are also a dark material into here. And, you know, we can go a little bit into more detail into materiality to start to show how that's going to look. And probably the best place to compare is all the facades. So let's click on this, this, and this. And that's how the 3 options look. You know, one is facing one way, the other one is facing the other way, and also the glass is varied a little bit, right? So that makes a bit of a difference here as well. And the third one, which is here. And actually, when we look at it at the front facade, it doesn't read as that different because we are simply understanding how the facade works. So let's compare these views that we've got over here as well. So that's top view and that's the side views. And again, these are they read really well. Here, the balconies, they're quite heavy, quite solid elements. So we either need to soften them up, or maybe we try to add some kind of grille into it to make that read a bit better. So let's go in here. All right, we go into edit mode with the item with the balcony. We select our balcony edge, and you know what? I think for now, let's just select facade panel. And yeah, that might start to read a little better. Now I'm going to edit this edge over here because it's no longer thick enough. But it should still feel as very much secondary to our primary element, which is over here. Okay. And then that base here, I mean, if we have elements that are already protruding a little bit, perhaps what we've got going on over here should feel even more solid. Sort of like that. And we can also change the material a little bit. So let's make it a bit darker. And we're going to play a lot more with the materiality in a bit. But for now, let's see, roughness 0 for the panel. Okay, so that roughness can't really be 0. That should be something like 0.4. There you go. That's much better. That was something that must have gotten changed along the way. Okay, so Here at the bottom though, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we want this to still feel like a separate base while not losing the edge of that element over here. So let's make this element a little bit thicker. In fact, let's take it all the way, but maybe because it's pushed down, it's going to look a bit better. Now, this is the same material as these elements over here. So let's change that just so once again we understand this a bit better. But now I believe this should probably be some kind of gray, some kind of white, so you feel that it is a base and it is separate. Or maybe not. Again, this is the kinds of things that you don't really understand until you test a couple of times. So here we are with another option. Let's just give it a random value of, well, I don't like the fact that we don't have balconies on top. Now, how are these, by the way, positioned? So I done a bunch of sketches of how the layouts here are. Usually we have like a bedroom, like the first module. Then this is the living space in the second module, and the toilet is behind. Then this is a mirrored apartment on the other side, so 1-bedroom apartments. And then here, you know, depending on the edges that we've got over here, we can have 1, 2, or 3-bedroom apartments. Now I'm noticing some artifacts when we're rendering this because we have some faces that are exactly along each other, but also adjusting the clip start could help us a bit with having the render feel a little cleaner. So we're ready with another option. Let's go ahead and call this option 04 and render it out. And then once again, compare. So here's our option 4, which is our latest option. And material clearly can use a lot of work. But perhaps that should stay as dark because it is easier to understand what's coming up and what isn't. And, you know, we either have a bedroom where we've got a window, or if it's not a bedroom, we've got a living space. So the balconies make sense everywhere. There isn't like a place where they wouldn't really make sense. So I'm quite happy with that setup. Now I'm just curious how that compares to the original renders that I did when I was prepping for this course. So that's what we had before. So clearly in here, you can see the panels are a bit more complex, right? So we got some facades that are coming in there, and the materiality is a bit more complicated. And we've also got a fence around, which is set up with geometry nodes. And we've got the cutaway, which shows some of the interiors. And there's also kind of an underground parking area where we go underneath, and you can kind of start to feel the paneling that we've got going on in there. Again, the panels, they're quite different. Well, all I can say is that they're just different. However, one thing we did not address is how to make mullions and, you know, separate glasses. So let's do that because we would need that no matter what we do. So let's go back into here with our modeling element and pick one. Actually, we would need to do it with both of them. So I'm going to maximize this view for a good minute here. Let's go in here and I'm going to select just this edge. In fact, let's do it for both at the same time. Select these and then Shift H hides everything but what's being selected. So now we have just our glass panels, which are, we have a measuring tool, by the way, in Blender, and they're about they're exactly 2 meters, which is really big panel, right? We wouldn't have, you can if you want to, but you want to be able to open that, and you don't want to open a 2-meter window because, yeah, that's going to be quite big, and you won't really. There's a lot of practical challenges to that. So let's divide both of these with loop cuts. So we'll create a loop cut here. And also these panels are 4 meters tall. So again, that's a little too much. So let's create 2 loop cuts in these directions. Let's select, so Alt click, Shift Alt click, Shift Alt click, Shift Alt click. Let's go to scale. And we want to scale these to be something like that. Maybe we don't need the bottom one. So Alt click and Shift Alt click, then X and edge loops. So we just have this top, and that top is not going to be glass, right? Because that's getting quite close to where we need floor space. Yeah, basically floor space. Sometimes I lose my words. Let's see if we can make this a nice number as well. So 2.7 or even less, 2.6 meters. Okay, so that's going to be, oops, we need to do the same here. 2.6. And now with these two elements, we're going to extrude them slightly in like that. It can be much less, 0.05. And I love the fact that people say that Blender is not precise, because here I am putting exactly the things that I need in there, right? So yeah, anyways, I like to mention that. Before I do that though, let's inset these. Now that's where it gets, okay, we did apply the scale in the previous video at some point, because otherwise our insets would be wrong. So now we can inset and type in 0.05. So that's the overall glazing frame that we've got. Now we're going to extrude this inwards. 0.1. I think that's all right. And now we're going to extrude this in again. And we want to do a couple of things here. So first, let's split. So if we move these, they're separate. That's going to help us with the materiality, because as you can see here, everything is still the same material, which is not going to be the case. And now if we go into inset faces again, and we're going to inset 0.01. So that's just for some kind of frame. And here we also want to select individual. So each one of these is insetting separately. Now modern windows, they're usually glued. So you have a minimal amount of mullion that looks like on the outside, but on the inside you have a lot more mullion. We won't worry about the inside too much at this point, but we want to make the outside look correct. So now we have these faces correctly selected, and we're going to extrude them 0.02 in, or maybe 0.01. 0.01. There you go. Great, so that's our glass. And once again, just to make selections a little bit easier, even though those are kind of big, so we shouldn't really worry terribly about it. But let's start assigning the correct materials. So we're going to make this facade panel so it's exactly the same as our neighbors here. And now I'm going to Alt click in face selection to select these faces over here, and those faces for the frame, plus Alt click here and Alt click here. And wow, that actually worked even though they're separate elements, and I wonder if the glass panels have to be the same. Anyways, so we need to make a new material here. So, and that material is going to be called frame. And again, we're just going to assign some strange color. Wow, it's working in both. I'm amazed. Actually, is it? No, it's not. I was going to be amazed. Always finding out new things in a way. So frame, assign, and that's going to be quite dark and metallic. Okay. And actually, this can all be frame as well. So assign, and then let's just go back, and because these are really big faces, we can easily grab them and assign glass. Now let's do the same here. I'm going to click all of this, shift deselect these faces, L to select, shift deselect, and add a new material slot, find our frame material, frame, and assign. There you go. So now they're both kind of similar, and we've got a panel, a glazing panel in there. So that's looking pretty good. I don't think there's much more work to be done in here. One thing we can do is clean up our slots. So if I go in here in this arrow and clean slots, clean material slots, and that gets rid of the materials that are no longer around. So they both have the same for materials. We should do the same here. That's actually not bad. Facade panel, glass, glass. Great. So we're ready to check out another option. Let's call this option 05. And we're ready to go. Right, and let's just compare. So this is a previous iteration, and that's the latest. And you can see we're adding a lot more detail. Now we need to do some of the same on the bottom, which by this point you probably have a pretty good idea of how to do that. But let's take a look at what else we can do here. So here's just searching for residential facade panels on Pinterest. And like we can see there are more with more variations. These here, that is a very similar way where we can do that, right? Like it's exactly the same. You can kind of understand the module, and within the module, this is type A, type B, type C, type A, or type D because it does have a window on top. So all that is like, fair game now. And in this case, it also doesn't matter which one goes where, except some of these are operable and some seem like they're not. So perhaps that makes a difference. But other than that, everything, these facades here, again, that kind of facade here, this is more straightforward, right? Because it's more of a similar, just simply a rate building. And in here we got like some more moves, right? So in our building, we're dealing with like a general overall move and then the panels within each one of them. Here they're breaking down the panels a little bit as well. So that's adding some extra levels of complexity. But because of our massing, we don't quite need to do that. And here as well, you can see how we've got like different types of setups. Again, I mean, if you look at residential facades these days, they're all fairly similar, aren't they? We can really easily do that. In fact, we have half of that in a way, don't we? We just don't have that bottom doing the same thing that it's doing over here. So, or, if you're going to a bigger building, like even this, even though, again, this is just the same facade, this is, let's say, in a way, a more complex building because it's larger, and inevitably when something is larger, it becomes a bit more complex in terms of structure, in terms of horizontal circulation and so on. But the facade panels, again, it's pretty straightforward and easy to understand. Some different ones. These are all the same, except this one is a bit wider. So at this point, I won't go and do a lot of other variations in the facade, but here we've got a system where hopefully you understand how clear it is and how easy it is now to sort of progress these and take them to the next level, which is to everything that we're seeing here of how to design these kinds of facade systems to vary. Even something like this, you have like a slight protrusion that comes in and then that comes out. And I think they're basically just flipped. I mean, that would be, let's try that out because that's a really basic and easy concept. This is really easy, but these aren't even, well, they're slightly different again because in some of them we have operable windows and in others we do not. And in fact, where there are no operable windows, they left them completely white, but we're also dealing with a much larger facade chunk. And even this, I would encourage you to try to create this. Of course, this is a little bit more complicated because it has to do with the tractors and how we change over the distance. But again, pretty straightforward stuff. So there was one that I wanted to do. Which one was it? One and I actually really love these that are pretty simple, pretty straightforward, panels, straightforward building, but it adds just an extra level of extrusion by having these kinds of panels in there. And you might have noticed that my original renders that I was doing for the preparation of this course, they're not to that level yet. They're missing a few extra levels, but they're trying to do that. You have like a strong horizontal, but I think the one that we're doing now has a much stronger design aesthetic and understanding than this initial one over here, because again, there might be a bit too much going on in here, and the level of simplicity that we achieved with the current one might be a bit better. So let's carry on with a couple more things here to wrap this session up, which is we want to add some simple mullions here at the base, at the ground level. And then we want to start adding a bit more of a sense of materiality. And once we do that, then in the following session, we're going to look at the interiors. And the way I like to do interiors is a little bit different. So it's going to be very much in the sense of parametric, setups that we have here. Non-destructive, let's call them, because they're not like some crazy geometry, but still give us a lot to play with that you might not be able to play with unless we are doing some kind of parametric system, which essentially this is what it is, except it's a bit more, let's say, hands-on. You don't need to create everything in geometry nodes or in Grasshopper or similar things. So that's the way I like to do interiors as well, because I like to have that level of flexibility that we're working with in order to be able to do things fast and more creatively. If we boggle down, first off, and be, again, so that we can be pretty precise, but besides the precision point, it's also important to be quick. And to me, that's more important than precision, at least at this level. At some level, like once you have a concept, once it's locked down, once it's approved, once you have an area schedule that people are happy and they understand with, then it's very nice point to move to the next level, which is to communicate that to the stakeholders. Cool. So I probably could have talked in doing this, but now I'm going to do this at let's say my regular speed here. So, and I'm going to make this really simple. We are going to need to have some, let's see, where's this 1.9? So that needs to be a little bit higher. So 2.2, let's say. Okay. And we're going to have something in here, and that's going to come out again, just a little bit of a extra definition. I always find helps of how these things would really come about, right? Because in here we've got some glazing that's really simple. And on the bottom though, because these are going to be operable wall, like we need a thicker frame. So 0.05 and extrude 0.02 in the negative. Okay, so select everything. We're gonna make this the same area, and I'm just going to grab the glass and make the glass glassy, if that makes sense. And as you can see, because of the way that we're dealing with this, everything transferred itself over except this last one, which let's redo really quickly. I'm going to try to snap as much as I can, and then extrude. Let's enable wireframe so I can see this a little bit better. Snapping a bit. They might not be at the same plane for some reason. That's all right. And that's the only thing I really want to do to this one. Although, you know what? I mean, we're so far into it, we might as well just make them the same. 0.02, negative, inset 0.01, extrude 0.01 in the negative direction, select everything, make it ground facade solid, and we're going to make this glass. Okay, so that concludes our exterior building finishing. Now we have a few more things to add, just to make, let's just say the exterior is done. We got, let's see, I'm gonna try to make this a little quicker. So first off, let's hide the panels, facade panels. Let's turn off the collection. And now let's create a new collection, which is called context. Context. the one. Okay. In fact, facade panels can go in there. And in the context, let's make sure that this is the active one. Add something in here and Shift A, mesh plane, go into edit mode, loop cut, Control I to select inverse X and edges. And I am going a lot faster now, but hopefully at this point you can follow me more or less and we can snap here. In fact, we could have just separated that, but that's all right. We're just going to do it here like that. Select everything, extrude Z, and that's going to be 1.8 meters. Next, and we want to grab these edges over here. Okay, and that edge over here. And now we want to solidify that. So let's add solidify modifier, and that's going to be 0.10 centimeters. How thick are these things? Like 0.7 meters, let's say. Scale is 1:1. No, not 0.7, 0.07. Even thickness. All right. We got a fence. Now, we might want to do, yeah, let's do it. The same kind of driveway, recessed driveway that I was doing before. I'm going to edit these two things together here, so we can do it quicker. To somewhere over here, okay. And in here, I'm going to add another loop cut. Let's drag it all the way, and now move it back 3 meters. 3.5 meters, let's say. Add another loop cut to somewhere over here, okay. And now that's going to be its own separate object, so I'm going to get rid of it. Let's get rid of that face. Just the face, X, and then faces. And now selecting this edge, and then let's go -4 meters. And we want a little bit of a situation here where we have these two edges aligned. And now let's grab these two and create a face. Grab, not two, they're 4, right? So create these two. F to make a face, create a face here. And now I'm going to extrude this slightly inwards like that. Okay. So that fence is actually going to go along this edge here, isn't it? And then it's going to go along this edge and along this edge. We also are going to have, in fact, let's separate this. All of these, right click, split, not separate, and now click on this edge. Let's see, which edge is it? Not the right one. That's the right one here, and grab this out over here. Now let's check out the materiality. This can get the same sort of pavement material. For now, that we have over here. Okay, so that's the first step. Probably have some kind of gate or gates to move this. So let's duplicate this face, Shift D, and put it somewhere over here. Move this edge over here. And now this is going to be, how tall is it going to be? Let's say 1 meter. Well, it could be higher, but just for the purposes of it looking like something different, it's going to be like that. We cut this here with a loop cut. By the way, I'm using Control R a lot instead of here. So I'm instead of the loop cut tool in here. And now let's bevel this edge. Just 2 loop cuts. That's too much, 0.05. And let's get rid of that face just so it looks like 2 separate elements. And drag these out a little bit, like 0.1 up. So now it looks like some kind of gate to go to the deepest, darkest underground. Let's duplicate these trees, Alt-D, put them somewhere over here, make them denser. So this is all in the array. In fact, to give it a bit more variation, let's use geometry nodes. So add modifier, geometry nodes, create a new one over here. And we're going to create a mesh line, and we're going to plug that in. And the direction is going to be in the, 5 meters maybe? And instance on points. So the points of the mesh line, so it has 10 points, that's where we're going to put each instance. Why are we doing this with geometry nodes if it's doing the exact same thing that we're doing here? Because we can give it a random rotation and a random scale. So how do we do that? So in here, we're going to drag out and look for random, and it's going to give us a random value. We actually don't want vector because we want the scale to be uniform in all 3 directions. So we can just use float, Shift D to duplicate this. And now we're going to use vector for the rotation. So this goes in here. And the minimum for the scale is something like 0.9 to 1.3. And now for the rotation, we want to leave the max to 0. And we just want to play with the Z rotation. And if we change that, you can see that it changes. So that's why we're doing it that way. In fact, we can play a little bit, minus 0.1 and 0.1 with the rotation along the different axes. So when it rotates, like trees are not always completely straight, are they? So that's what this helps us with here. And we can increase the count and maybe reduce the spacing to something like 4 meters. Not 0.4, 4 meters. 4.5 meters. There you go. And maybe we can increase the maximum scale to something like 1.4. So now you can see these trees are looking like they're family, but each one is a bit different, which is more natural, let's say. So the context is ready. This is how it looks. Perhaps that wall could be a slightly different color. Perhaps not. I think for the purposes of what we're doing here, that's quite all right. Excellent. So we got our panels, we got this, and let's just play a little bit more with the materials now. A little bit more, yes. I like to make fun of myself. And by going now into here, and the facade solid. Okay, so we don't even have a material yet. So let's create a material that's called facade solid. Okay, and let's make sure that we're in the right shader editor here. Okay, and now in here in the shader editor, Shift A, search, and we want to find a brick texture. Let's plug that in and see what it looks like. From the beginning, it doesn't look like much. From the vector output, we want to use UV from texture coordinate. That also doesn't look really good. So now we're going to go to Edit, Preferences. In the add-ons, rather extensions, we're going to look for UV, Magic UV. So let's install Magic UV. This used to be something that shipped with Blender, but it doesn't. And now, once we have this enabled, if we go into edit mode, UV, in here, we should have something called UVW. And let's click on UVW Best Planar. And that should be to everything. So let's try that again. UVW. Well, so we can try their box if one works well. The scale is correct. Yeah, I'm kind of happy with that. Some edges don't quite work the way that I was expecting them to, but some do. So what we can do in here is add a mapping, vector mapping. And sometimes it's, first off, we can play with the scale. So we drag out a value in here and we type in something like 10. And if we change this from a point to a texture, now that becomes a bigger scale. Now we can play with the rotation. So that doesn't work. 0, 90, That doesn't work. What I'm trying to get is for the edge here to sort of follow that nicely. And sometimes you have to play it a bit to get it right. Let's see if this is working. I'm not really happy with that. So let's try again UVW, best planar. And let's try a different size, see if that works a bit better. For some reason though, this best planar is not really working right. So let's try. Sometimes it's also worth just checking out and seeing if generator works well. Sometimes it does, but not always. So I had to stop the video here for a second and work with this because somehow it's still, after all this experience, somehow every once in a while it can still be a mystery, UVs. So I had to try all kinds of different ways to make it, and it was working on this side, on the rear side, but on the front it wasn't. So in the end, I select everything, and then UV, unwrap, and I used angle base, which is the most commonly used version, and that seemed to work quite alright. And then changed the scale of it to 10. And went back to point, which means that the bigger the number, the bigger the scale. And as you can see, it's still not ideal. There's some that just look a bit strange, but I think for the most part this is going to work pretty well with what we need over here. Okay, so let's carry on and continue to modify this. So we don't want to have an offset, we want all these to be sort of even, and now we want to change the mortar size to something like 0.002. So it's going to be really small. Now these variations here, they're also going to be quite a lot more minimal, let's say. So we can even Control C, Control V to copy the actual color. And let's turn off the wireframe so we can start to see things a little bit better. And yeah, there's some lines that are just not really happy with their color, but that's okay because we're going to turn them down a little bit, quite a bit, by changing this color over here. So that's our base color. Now, it's always a good idea to add a bit of noise texture in here because the noise makes everything feel a little bit better, a little bit stronger. So, and we can see the factor, like exactly what the noise does over here. And I like to add more detail, so maybe like 10. And the roughness, if it's 1, you can see we get a much more refined noise. Now, if we plug in the same vector information that we had from here, that should be a lot more even. And now I'm also noticing that I should do auto smooth to this object so it's nice and smooth. So we're going to overlay now this noise texture on top of what we've got over here with a mix color node. So in fact, this could even be the factor for which we multiply this color that we've got here. So it's basically something that goes on top with a specific color. And you see the darker we make that, the darker it gets. So right away, this looks way better than what we had before. And we don't need to keep that as dark. Now we want to use this factor, which looks like just the lines, as a normal. So that's going to give us that variation between the different kinds of panels. Let's make them a little bit smaller as well, 0.01. And from normal, we're going to drag a bump node. And now we're going to plug this into the height and plug that into there. And now we should start to see some variation. Sometimes we might need to invert this so it's going inwards instead of outwards. And that's exactly what we did here now. So this is already, and you can see it's really starting to look like some kind of tiles, some kind of panels. Now we're going to replicate this setup that we set up over here. So Control C, let's go into here, into the base, ground facade solids. Let's get rid of everything that we have and paste that into here. Now, this is going to be simpler because it's basically extruded. It doesn't have any funny shape. So we might get away with using just the object. So if you hold Control and Shift and drag everything that goes into UV into object, actually it's just Control. And now let's see how our paneling is looking. Let's try 1 or 30. Okay, we might need to unwrap. I try to avoid wrapping as much as possible, which is possible in some instances, but in others, as you can see, it's very much something that's needed. So yeah, okay. I can live with the fact that we need to go in here, select everything, U for unwrap, and now we're going to use Sure UVW box because that should work perfectly fine. Select everything here, U, Sure UVW box, and let's go back now into this material, ground facade solids, and change this number to something smaller. And yeah, we can see our tile sizes over here. They're a little bit too small, so let's make them bigger and darker because the color is the same as what we had before. So Control C, Control V, and just make one a bit darker than the other. And now we want to limit the amount of extra noise. Actually, they're really small, so we need to go the other direction, so 0.5 to make them bigger. 0.1. Okay, that's looking really good, except we don't want to have as much variation with the colors. And what did I do here? There you go. Let's just have this ever so slightly smaller, 0.1. There you go. And of course, in this case, the mortar has to be much darker as well. So that's the materiality in here, which is kind of done. Well, okay, so we have the frame. So we do need a separate frame material in this case as well. I think we have one, don't we? Frame. So let's go into here and select everything. It's this material. And now Shift deselect. Make sure we're using face selection. These faces over here. And now assign frame. And that frame is quite dark. Okay. And we need to do the same over here at the edge. So I'm just going to select these two face loops. And add the frame material, frame. Okay. So that's kind of done. And now the question is, okay, on top, what kind of material is that? I mean, we're going with these kinds of tiled panels everywhere, so it feels like it might be a good idea to do the same here. Of course, we can't just select the facade because the facade is not the actual facade. So let's go and enable in the one facade panels chosen. And in here, facade panel, let's delete all that and let's see if this copy paste still works. It does. I'm really hoping that we can use generated here, or rather object, and make them quite small. Nope, doesn't work. Need to use UVs. That's right. UVW box. Let's make sure this we do the same here. UVW box. That should be the same. Okay. Click on the facade panel, and yeah, we want to make them quite dark. And Similar. And the mortar is a dark size. Are these panels, are these not? I mean, these are hard panels to make, so that these balconies, they're going to be something different. They can't be tiles, especially when they're rounded. That's cast in place concrete that's done just for the job. So let's create a new material, concrete, and let's add a noise texture in here. See how it looks. Oh, we need to assign this and mix color. And once again, we're going to do this a little bit different. So the factor is the factor, mix is multiply. So we're just adding the darkness into here. And this is some kind of dark concrete. And the detail of this is, well, the roughness is really what we want to work with. The scale can be bigger. And yeah, the detail can be a lot more as well. And we're going to use that same thing for bump for the normal. So if we plug it into height, now that should start to get a little bumpy. So it gives us a sense of something that looks like concrete. Reduce the strength and the distance. Maybe strength is 0.2 and the distance is 0.1. So now it's looking more concrete-like. Great, and that's it with the materiality. At this point, let's hide our facade panels again and go to a view just to see how it looks. Cool, and once again, we're ready to render. So, well, I pressed F12. I didn't want to press F12. Let's see how this is looking now into cycles. So far, we've been dealing with Eevee. And cycles shouldn't look that different. It just adds a little bit of extra refinement in the details. Sometimes it doesn't. So interesting. So the pattern is coming out a lot better in Eevee. It's more subtle in cycles, but the shadows are better. So anyways, we're going to say that this is a cycles version, which is going to take a lot longer to render. So I'm going to press render. And it's going to take a good few minutes, and then we're going to compare. Okay, so here's the result. So I added a couple of people and just spread those trees a little bit more apart so we can see everything, and changed the background so it's a little bit darker gray so we can see the edge of the building a bit more clearer. And yeah, pretty happy with this result. So we're ready to move on to the interiors in the next session.